Science offers a promising horizon where mental sharpness does not have to decline in lockstep with the calendar years. Many individuals operate under the discouraging assumption that memory loss and cognitive fog are inevitable consequences of aging, accepting these deficits as merely part of the genetic lottery or standard wear and tear. This fatalistic view ignores the profound plasticity of the human nervous system, which retains the capacity to rewire and regenerate well into the 8th and ninth decades of life. By understanding the specific neurobiological levers that control brain health, one can dismantle the common enemy of passive decline. The path forward involves identifying and mitigating the single most corrosive emotional state that accelerates neural degeneration. Drawing on the neurobiological frameworks of Andrew Huberman, this exploration provides a structured understanding of how to protect the aging brain from the ravages of stress chemistry and preserve vital cognitive function. The biological mechanism of stress and neural atrophy, the human brain, is an organ of incredible resilience, yet it possesses specific vulnerabilities that become more pronounced after the age of 70. At the center of memory formation and emotional regulation lies a seahorse-shaped structure known as the hippocampus. This region is unique because it is one of the few areas in the adult brain capable of neurogenesis, the process of birthing new neurons throughout the lifespan. However, Andrew Huberman emphasizes that this regenerative capacity is strictly regulated by the chemical environment in which these neurons reside. The primary antagonist to this regenerative process is cortisol, a glucocorticoid hormone released by the adrenal glands during moments of perceived threat or strain. While cortisol is essential for waking up in the morning and mobilizing energy for acute challenges, its chronic elevation acts as a neurotoxin to the hippocampus. When an individual remains in a state of high alert for extended periods, the receptors on hippocampal neurons become overwhelmed, leading to a cessation of new cell growth and eventually the death of existing neural connections. This biological cascade explains why the aging brain is particularly susceptible to environments characterized by unrelenting pressure. In a younger nervous system, the feedback loops that shut down the stress response are robust and snappy, quickly returning the body to a baseline of calm. As the body ages, these braking mechanisms can become less efficient, meaning that a stress response triggered by a minor event might linger for hours or days rather than minutes. The neurobiology suggests that it is not the intensity of the stressor itself that causes the damage, but the duration of the chemical bath in which the brain is immersed. The hippocampus, which is responsible for indexing memories and placing them in the correct context of time and space, begins to shrink under this toxic load. This atrophy manifests practically as a loss of short-term memory and a difficulty in navigating new environments. Symptoms often misdiagnosed as irreversible dementia rather than the result of a modifiable chemical imbalance. Consider the scenario of a retiree who finds themselves constantly monitoring their financial stability or the health of a spouse. This person might not feel panic in the traditional sense, but they experience a low-level hum of concern that runs in the background from the moment they wake until they attempt to sleep. Every news report or unexpected bill triggers a release of norepinephrine and cortisol that does not fully dissipate. Over weeks and months, this chemical state signals to the brain that the environment is unsafe for the resource-intensive process of building new memories. The brain essentially shifts into survival mode, prioritizing immediate threat detection over the complex cognitive architecture required for learning a new language, remembering names, or recalling where the car is parked. This prioritization is a survival mechanism gone awry, where the body sacrifices long-term cognitive capital to survive a perceived immediate danger that never actually resolves. It is important to acknowledge that navigating the later chapters of life inevitably involves complex challenges and profound losses. The goal is not to eliminate difficult circumstances, which is impossible, but to alter the physiological response to them. The damage occurs when the autonomic nervous system gets stuck in the sympathetic branch, the fight or flight mode, without the ability to toggle back to the parasympathetic rest and digest state. This rigidity is what accelerates biological aging. Andrew Huberman points out that the ability to consciously disengage the stress response is a skill that can be strengthened, much like a muscle. Without this intervention, the constant flood of inflammatory markers associated with chronic stress begins to degrade the blood-brain barrier, allowing toxins to enter neural tissue and further accelerate cognitive decline. The integrity of the brain's vascular system is intimately tied to this stress regulation, linking heart health directly to memory preservation. One must also consider the role of sleep in this degenerative equation. Cortisol and melatonin operate in an inverse relationship. When stress hormones are high in the evening, the brain cannot achieve the deep, restorative stages of sleep where the glymphatic system washes away metabolic waste. The accumulation of proteins like beta amyloid is exacerbated by this lack of clearance. Therefore, a chronic state of stress creates a double-edged sword. It directly kills neurons through excitotoxicity and indirectly damages the brain by robbing it of the nightly cleaning process required for cellular repair. The aging brain has less margin for error in this regard. A missed night of sleep at 20 is a minor inconvenience. At 70, it represents a significant disruption to neurochemical homeostasis. Understanding this mechanism provides the leverage point for change, shifting the focus from vague stress management to precise physiological control. Furthermore, the impact of this chemical state extends to the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function and decision-making. High levels of catecholamines, neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, can facilitate focus in short bursts, but when chronically elevated, they create a kind of neural noise that scatters attention. For the senior individual, this feels like an inability to focus on a book or follow a complex conversation. It is not necessarily that the cognitive machinery is broken, but rather that it is being jammed by a relentless alarm signal. The tragedy is that this state is often self-perpetuating. The realization that one's memory is slipping causes anxiety, which releases more cortisol, which further inhibits memory. Breaking this feedback loop requires a deliberate intervention that targets the body's physiology first, using the body to calm the mind rather than trying to think one's way out of stress. Limitations exist in how much one can control the external environment, and certainly genetics play a non-negotiable role in the baseline health of the brain. There are individuals who, despite living stressful lives, maintain cognitive clarity due to robust genetic buffers. However, relying on genetic luck is not a strategy. The vast majority of the population is sensitive to the neurotoxic effects of chronic stress, and ignoring this biological reality is the fastest route to premature cognitive aging. The mechanism is clear. A nervous system that cannot turn off its vigilance system is a nervous system that is actively digesting its own capacity for memory. Recognizing this allows the individual to stop viewing memory loss as a mysterious ailment and start seeing it as a physiological state that requires a specific behavioral antidote. What habitual worry am I holding on to that serves no purpose but to exhaust me? Chronic hypervigilance and the suspension of recovery, the specific emotional state that ages the brain most rapidly, is not sudden grief or acute anger, but rather chronic hypervigilance. This emotion is a sustained form of anxiety characterized by a persistent feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Andrew Huberman identifies this state as a particular form of limbic friction, where the brain is constantly predicting negative outcomes. Unlike a sharp burst of fear, which resolves quickly, hypervigilance keeps the autonomic nervous system in a suspended state of agitation. This prevents the body from ever fully entering the regenerative modes necessary for tissue repair and memory consolidation. For an individual over 70, this state is particularly pernicious because it masquerades as prudence or responsibility. It feels necessary to be constantly on guard regarding health issues, family dynamics, or global events, yet this very vigilance is the metabolic tax that bankrupts the brain's energy reserves. When a person lives in a state of hypervigilance, their visual system and attentional spotlight are narrowed. The pupils dilate slightly, and the brain stem activates circuits designed for threat detection. This physiological posture consumes immense amounts of glucose and oxygen, resources that are then diverted away from the creative and reflective centers of the brain. Over time, this results in a rigidity of thought. The individual finds it harder to accept new ideas or adapt to changes because the brain is locked into a rigid prediction model focused solely on survival and error detection. This explains why chronic anxiety often correlates with a certain stubbornness or resistance to novelty in later life. It is not a personality flaw, but a resource management strategy by a brain that feels under siege. The constant secretion of adrenaline, even in microdoses, keeps the neural circuits firing in a loop of worry, etching these negative pathways deeper into the neural architecture. Consider the daily life of someone who has internalized this state of vigilance. They may wake up and immediately scan their body for new aches or pains, interpreting normal fluctuations in physiology as signs of catastrophic decline. They might watch the news and feel a visceral connection to distant tragedies, their heart rate elevating slightly, but never returning to a true resting baseline. This person is physically present at a family dinner, but their mind is elsewhere, scanning for potential conflicts or rehearsing future problems. This fractured presence prevents the release of oxytocin and serotonin, neurochemicals that are vital for buffering the brain against the damaging effects of cortisol. The tragedy of hypervigilance is that it isolates the individual within a fortress of their own making, cutting them off from the very social interactions that serve as the most potent neuroprotective factors. This emotional state also significantly disrupts the dopaminergic system. Dopamine is not just a reward molecule. It is the chemical of motivation and pursuit. In a healthy brain, dopamine drives the individual to seek out new experiences and engage with the world. However, chronic vigilance suppresses this exploratory drive. The brain learns that it is safer to stay put and scan for danger than to venture out and risk the unknown. This results in a shrinking life, where the boundaries of one's world contract to the walls of one's home. The lack of novel stimulation further accelerates hippocampal atrophy, as the brain operates on a use it or lose it principle. Without the signal that new information needs to be processed, the brain stops investing energy in maintaining the synaptic connections that support learning and memory. A critical distinction must be made between being prepared and being hypervigilant. Preparation is a logical set of actions taken to mitigate risk. Hypervigilance is an emotional state of ongoing arousal that persists regardless of the actions taken. The former is adaptive, the latter is maladaptive. Andrew Huberman often discusses the concept of state control, noting that the ability to recognize which state one is in is the first step toward regulation. Many seniors live in a chronic stress state without realizing it because it has become their new normal. They have forgotten what true relaxation feels like. This lack of contrast makes it difficult to identify the problem. They attribute their fatigue and mental cloudiness to old age rather than to the relentless energy expenditure of maintaining a defensive psychological posture. It is worth noting that this state often stems from a feeling of losing control, a common sentiment as one ages and faces physical limitations or the loss of peers. The brain attempts to regain a sense of agency by overanalyzing the environment. However, this is a maladaptive coping mechanism. The control that is sought through worry is an illusion, while the damage being done to the neural substrate is very real. The prefrontal cortex, which should be regulating the emotional centers of the brain, becomes exhausted by the constant demand to inhibit fear responses. Eventually, the emotional centers take the driver's seat, leading to emotional volatility or flatness. This explains why anxiety and depression are often comorbid with cognitive decline. They share the same underlying dysregulation of the stress response system. Addressing this issue requires a shift in perspective regarding what constitutes effort. For many, relaxing feels like laziness or a lack of diligence. However, from a neurobiological standpoint, relaxation is a highly active metabolic process where the most critical maintenance work occurs. By reframing rest as a form of neural engineering, one can begin to dismantle the guilt associated with letting go of vigilance. The brain requires periods of absolute safety, chemical safety, to perform the delicate work of encoding memories and clearing waste. Denying the brain this safety through chronic worry is akin to running a car engine at maximum RPM while it's parked in the garage. It achieves no movement, but ensures rapid mechanical failure. Why do I believe that my worrying is keeping me safe? Physiological protocols for neural preservation, the antidote to the corrosive effects of chronic vigilance, is not found in abstract advice to calm down, but in concrete physiological protocols that forcibly shift the autonomic nervous system. Andrew Huberman advocates for a bottom-up approach, using the body to control the mind. One of the most potent tools for this is the manipulation of the respiratory system. The physiological sigh, a pattern of 2 sharp inhales through the nose followed by a long, extended exhale through the mouth, is a hardwired mechanism for offloading carbon dioxide and rapidly slowing the heart rate. This specific breathing pattern engages the phrenic nerve and the diaphragm in a way that signals immediate safety to the brain. For a senior experiencing a surge of anxiety or a lapse in memory, performing this sigh 2 or 3 times can mechanically disengage the stress response, halting the flood of cortisol and preserving neural tissue. Light exposure acts as another critical lever for regulating brain chemistry. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, the body's master clock, resides just above the roof of the mouth and relies on light signals to orchestrate the release of every hormone in the body. Viewing bright sunlight within the first hour of waking is arguably the single most important behavior for anchoring the circadian rhythm. This practice triggers a timed release of cortisol early in the day, when it is useful for alertness, and sets a timer for the release of melatonin 16 hours later. For the aging brain, this robust circadian signal is essential for ensuring deep sleep and preventing the sundowning or late-day confusion that often plagues seniors. It is a simple, cost-free intervention that fundamentally stabilizes the neurochemical landscape. Non-sleep deep rest, NSDR, or Yoga Nidra, offers a more profound intervention for those whose stress baselines are chronically high. This practice involves a guided body scan that drops the brain into theta wave states, similar to those experienced during the transition into sleep. Huberman highlights that 20 minutes of NSDR can replenish dopamine reserves and reduce cortisol levels as effectively as several hours of sleep. This is not merely napping. It is a specific protocol for resetting the nervous system's idle speed. For an individual over 70, integrating a daily session of NSDR serves as a buffer, washing away the accumulated stress of the day before it can consolidate into long-term damage. It provides the hippocampus with a window of respite, allowing neurotrophic factors to support cell survival. Another powerful but often overlooked protocol involves the use of the visual system to modulate state. When we focus intensely on a problem, our vision narrows, a phenomenon known as focal vision. This activates the sympathetic nervous system. Conversely, consciously expanding one's gaze to include the periphery, panoramic vision, activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Taking a daily walk where the goal is not exercise but rather optic flow, allowing images to pass by the eyes while keeping the gaze soft and wide, can lower anxiety levels significantly. This practice uncouples the brain from the hyper-focused vigilance that dominates the anxious mind. It creates a physiological state of movement and forward progression, which suppresses the amygdala's fear circuitry. Applied scenarios for these tools are limitless. Imagine sitting in a doctor's waiting room, a classic trigger for hypervigilance. Instead of reading worrying news on a phone, the individual can engage in panoramic vision, softening their gaze to take in the whole room and quietly practice the physiological sigh. This transforms a period of toxic stress into a micro-session of neural regulation. Similarly, if waking up in the middle of the night with racing thoughts, utilizing an NSDR audio track can bridge the gap back to sleep without the frustration that usually accompanies insomnia. These are not intellectual exercises. They are mechanical overrides for a nervous system that has forgotten how to power down. It is crucial to recognize the limitation that these protocols are not magic pills. They require consistency and repetition to reshape the neural pathways. The brain changes through neuroplasticity, but only when the neurochemical conditions are right. Performing a physiological psi once a month will not save the hippocampus. However, making it a reflexive response to stress will. The goal is to build a toolkit that is accessible at any moment, reducing the duration of the stress response. This reduction in duration is the metric of success. If a stressful event used to ruin a whole day and now only ruins an hour, that is a massive victory for brain health. Ultimately, these physical interventions serve to rebuild the trust between the conscious mind and the autonomic body. When an individual realizes they have a brake pedal, that they can manually slow their heart rate and clear their mind, the feeling of helplessness that fuels chronic anxiety begins to evaporate. This restoration of agency is itself neuroprotective. It shifts the internal narrative from one of inevitable decline to one of active stewardship. By mastering these simple biological inputs, breath, light, vision, and rest, the aging individual constructs a physiological environment where the brain can thrive rather than merely survive. When was the last time I used my breath to signal safety to my body? Conclusion. The neuroplasticity of later years, the narrative that the brain over 70 is a static, decaying organ is scientifically outdated. We now understand that neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, persists until the very end of life, provided the biological conditions are met. The use it or lose it principle applies strictly, but it must be paired with the rest and repair principle. The integration of Andrew Huberman's insights reveals that the enemy is not age itself, but the accumulation of unbuffered stress. By systematically lowering the noise of chronic vigilance, we clear the channel for new learning and memory retention. The hippocampus remains ready to grow, awaiting the chemical signal that the environment is safe enough to invest in the future. Social connection acts as the final, critical layer of this neuroprotective strategy. The nervous system is designed to co-regulate with others. Isolation is perceived by the deep brain as a survival threat. Engaging in meaningful conversation, maintaining eye contact, and sharing experiences releases a cocktail of oxytocin and serotonin that directly opposes the effects of cortisol. The effort to maintain social bonds is not just a leisure activity. It is a rigorous neural workout that taxes the memory, executive function, and emotional centers in the healthiest way possible. It forces the brain to remain agile, predictive, and responsive. The future of healthy aging lies in this conscious ownership of one's physiology. It is a shift from being a passenger in a declining vehicle to becoming the driver of a sophisticated machine that requires specific maintenance. The promise is not eternal youth, but a mind that remains clear, capable, and connected. By refusing to harbor chronic resentment and anxiety, and by actively employing tools to reset the nervous system, one protects the very essence of the self. The cognitive vitality observed in superagers is rarely an accident. It is the result of a nervous system that has mastered the art of returning to calm. Am I ready to treat my peace of mind as a biological necessity?